Welcome back to Scripted Fear, where real experiences turn into stories. Before we begin, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Tonight's stories comes from real victims. We had changed some details for privacy reasons. Now let's get into it. I want to start by telling you what kind of person I am, because it matters. I am not jumpy. I am not superstitious. I grew up on 40 acres in Breathitt County, Kentucky. The kind of land that teaches you early that the world runs on causes and effects and nothing else. My father was a practical man who fixed everything himself and explained everything he couldn't fix in terms of what he didn't yet understand, not in terms of what couldn't be understood. I went to college for 2 years, dropped out, came home, and spent the next 15 years doing property assessments for the county, which means I have walked into more abandoned houses, more overgrown lots, more places where something bad happened a long time ago than most people do in a lifetime. I have found dead animals and dead people. I have found rooms full of things that suggested a person's private life in ways I had no right to see. I have found a basement in a house on Leatherwood Creek that had a lock on the outside of the door and a cot inside. And I filed my report and I went home. And I slept fine. I am telling you this so that when I describe what I found on Harlan Pryce's land, you understand that I have a high baseline, that it takes something real to move me. Harlan Pryce died intestate in February of the year I'm writing about. He was 83. Had lived alone on his property since his wife passed in 2009, and had no children and no living relatives that anyone in the county could name. The property reverted to the state, and my job was to walk it, document structures, assess value, note anything the county needed to know before it listed the land for sale. Standard work. I'd done it dozens of times. The property was about 62 acres of mixed timber and steep pasture in a hollow that dead-ended against a ridge about 4 miles off the county road. Harlan's house was a small 2-story tin roof, covered porch, a barn behind it that had seen better decades. The driveway was gravel that gave way to packed dirt at the halfway point. I drove up on a Tuesday morning in early March, parked in front of the house, and spent most of that first day on the structures. The house was in reasonable shape for its age, as the barn needed work but wasn't a liability. I noted the septic, the electric meter, the condition of the well housing. I took my photographs. I wrote my notes. I drove back down to the county road and went home for dinner. I came back Wednesday to walk the perimeter. The day was cold and overcast, the kind of March day that can't make up its mind. And I spent about 5 hours moving along the fence lines, checking corner markers, noting the timber stands and the condition of the pasture fencing. The land was quiet in the way that places are quiet when they've been tended by one person for decades and that person is gone. Not empty, held. Like it was still waiting for Harlan to come back out and tell it what to do next. I didn't find anything unusual. I drove home, wrote up my notes, planned to finish the following week. I came back the following Tuesday to walk the back acreage, the part that climbed up toward the ridge. This was the part that wasn't pasture, wasn't maintained, just timber and undergrowth and the creek drainage that ran along the eastern edge of the property. I was about 3/4 of a mile in, moving through a stand of second-growth oak, when I found the well. It was off any path, in a slight depression between 2 low ridges, surrounded by old-growth trees that suggested this particular spot hadn't been cleared or disturbed in a very long time. The well was hand-dug, stone-lined, capped with a fitted granite slab that had been mortared in place. Not a working well, not something you'd use for water. The house had a drilled well by the porch, a modern one with a pump. This thing back in the woods was older than the house, older than Harlan, possibly older than anyone who had owned this land in living memory. I noted it I photographed it. I moved on. What I noticed when I got home and uploaded my photographs was this. The mortar around the granite cap was recent. Not fresh, but not old. Maybe 5 to 10 years, compared to the stone lining beneath it, which was easily a century. Someone had sealed this well within the last decade. Harlan had been alive until February. Harlan would have been the one to do it. I went back on Thursday because the sealed cap was a county concern. An old well on land going up for sale needed to be noted in the assessment with its condition documented. I needed to confirm the seal was intact, assess whether it posed any liability, and note whether it needed to be filled and capped properly per county code. That was the whole reason I went back. I want to be clear about that, because what I did next was the reasonable thing to do, given my job. The mortar had been breached, not broken, not crumbled, cut. Someone had cut a clean line through the mortar on one side of the granite cap with what looked like a masonry blade, neat and straight, just enough to get a pry bar under the stone. The slab had been shifted maybe 3 inches, leaving a gap on one side. Not enough to fall into, enough to look. I looked. I had a flashlight and I pointed it down into the gap and I looked. The shaft was about 4 feet in diameter and the stone lining went down clean for maybe 20 feet before the light gave out. The walls were dry. There was no smell of water, no dampness, no mineral seep. Just dry stone going down into dark. And on the walls, on every stone I could see from the gap, scratched into the surface in thin, irregular lines, were marks. Not letters, not symbols I recognized. Marks, dozens of them on every visible stone. The same mark repeated over and over. A short vertical line crossed by a diagonal, like a crude letter, but not any letter from any alphabet I knew. The same mark, scratched by hand, covering every stone from just below the cap line all the way down to where the light ran out. I told myself it was old. I told myself previous owners, children maybe, had climbed down in there and scratched at the walls the way kids do. I replaced the slab as best I could. I wrote in my report that the well cap had been disturbed, possibly by animals or weather, and recommended it be professionally sealed before sale. The thing I keep coming back to is the mortar, where the original cap had been mortared shut by Harlan 5 to 10 years ago, a man in his late 70s doing serious masonry work in the woods, 4 miles from any help because he wanted that well sealed. And then, in the week between my first visit and my Thursday visit, someone cut through that mortar and moved the slab. Not open. Moved 3 inches. Just enough to fit a hand in. Just enough to reach down into the shaft and run your fingers along the marked stones. Just enough to remind whatever was down there that someone up here still knew where it was. The property sold in August to a family from Lexington. I signed off on the assessment. I listed the well as a non-functioning historic feature, sealed and stable. I did not include the marks. I did not include the fact that the seal had been cut. I didn't include it because I couldn't explain it, and unexplained things in an assessment create questions I couldn't answer. But I think about Harlan Pryce, 80 years old, walking 4 miles into the back of his own property with a bag of mortar and a float and spending an afternoon sealing a well in the woods. And I think about why a man would do that in the last years of his life. What he was sealing in or sealing out, or sealing shut so that after he was gone and the land changed hands, the new owner wouldn't go looking, wouldn't find it, wouldn't move the slab 3 inches, put a flashlight into the gap. I think about what he knew about those marks that I don't. I think about what was down there making them. And I think about who came back between my first visit and my second, 4 miles into the woods on unmarked land, and cut through Harlan's mortar and slid that slab open just enough to reach a hand inside. Not to open it, just to let it know that whoever did it was still out there. Still coming around, still keeping track of the thing at the bottom of the well on Harlan Pryce's land. Whatever it is that covers every stone in the dark with the same mark, over and over, all the way down. Some things get sealed for good reasons. The worst part is when the seal doesn't hold. Let me tell you what I know about children and what I know about this hollow before I tell you what I saw. Because both things matter. I have 4 kids. The oldest is 16, the youngest is 9. I have been driving them to the end of our road to catch the school bus every morning for 11 years, and I know each one of them the way you know the back of your own hand. The way they stand, the way they hold their backpack straps, the way my youngest rocks on her heels when she's bored or cold. I know what my children look like. I am not the kind of mother who mistakes a stranger's child for her own. I am also not the kind of woman who frightens easily. I grew up in Lincoln County, West Virginia. I have lived here my entire life. I know what these hills hold and what they don't, and I have a very accurate sense of which sounds and sights belong here and which ones don't. I say all of this because when I tell you what I noticed about the child at the bus stop, I need you to understand that I dismissed it for 6 weeks before I stopped dismissing it. 6 weeks. That is not a woman who panics. The bus stop for our road is at the junction where our gravel lane meets the state route. There's a telephone pole there and a rusted metal sign and a strip of flat gravel shoulder wide enough for the bus to slow down and let the kids on. My 4 line up there every morning at 7:15. Sometimes there are kids from the Dempsey family who live another quarter-mile back, 3 of them, elementary age, who come up the road and wait with mine. It's a small group. 7 children on a good day. I know all of them by sight and by name. The first time I saw the extra child, I thought it was a Dempsey cousin. The Dempseys have a lot of cousins, and they pass through the hollow regularly, especially in the fall when the family gatherings start. I was sitting in my car with the heat running, watching through the windshield while the kids waited, and I counted 8 children instead of 7. The extra one was standing slightly apart from the others, at the far edge of the gravel shoulder near the ditch. A child, maybe 10 or 11, wearing dark clothes, standing still while the others moved around and talked. I noted it. I thought nothing of it. The bus came, the kids got on, and I drove back up to the house. The second and third mornings were the same. 8 children. The extra one at the edge of the group, slightly apart, standing very still while the others moved. On the 4th morning, I rolled down my window and looked more carefully. The child was a boy, I thought, or a slight girl, hard to tell from the distance and the early light. Dark jacket, dark pants, no backpack. Standing at the edge of the gravel, facing the road, not looking at the other kids, not moving. I thought about calling over to the Dempsey children and asking whose cousin it was. But the bus came before I had a chance, and the morning moved on. I asked my daughter that evening if she knew the new child at the bus stop. She looked at me with the particular blankness of a teenager who has stopped registering the landscape around her and said, "What new child?" I said the one who stands at the edge, near the ditch. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I let it go. I assumed she'd simply stopped noticing things that weren't her phone. This went on for 3 weeks. Every morning, the extra child at the edge of the group, either every morning, standing still, facing the road. I started paying more attention. I started watching for the child to arrive, to walk up from somewhere, to come from a car, to appear from the direction of one of the houses on the state route. It never came from anywhere. One morning it was there, and the morning before, it hadn't been. That was the pattern, not a consistent one. Some mornings, 7 children, some mornings 8, with no logic to which mornings had 8 that I could work out. In the 4th week, I got out of the car. I told myself I was being foolish and overprotective, and that I simply needed to walk over and introduce myself and find out whose child this was, and whether they needed a ride to school or a phone call made or anything practical. I turned off the engine and got out. My kids saw me coming, and my oldest gave me the specific look she reserves for maternal embarrassments. I walked toward the group. I walked toward the edge of the group. The extra child was there, a few feet from the others, still facing the road. When I got to within about 10 feet, my daughter stepped into my path and said, "Mom, what are you doing?" I said I was just coming to say hi. She gave me a look and said to who. I pointed. I said to the child standing right there. My daughter turned to look where I was pointing and then turned back to me and said, "Mom, there is nobody there." And the bus came around the bend, and the kids started moving, and I stood on the gravel shoulder in the cold morning air and watched 7 children climb onto the bus and tried to understand what had just happened. And I came back to the stop alone that afternoon when the bus brought them home. I walked the gravel shoulder carefully. At the far edge, near the ditch, in the soft mud where the gravel gave out, there were footprints. Child-sized, narrow, pointed at the toes like dress shoes, not sneakers. They faced the road. They didn't move. No scuffing, no shifting of weight. Whoever made them had stood in that one spot, facing the road, and not moved at all. The prints were pressed deep, not the shallow impressions of a child standing for a few minutes. The impressions of significant weight held in one place for a long time. The following Monday, I called the elementary school and asked if any student had recently enrolled who lived in our area, a child who might be catching the bus at our stop. They checked. No new enrollments for our route, and I called the Dempseys. No cousins visiting, no extra children in the family that fall. I drove the state route in both directions and knocked on the doors of the 4 houses nearest our junction. Nobody was missing a child. Nobody had a child who might be walking to our stop. Nobody knew what I was talking about. I watched for 6 more mornings. The child appeared on 3 of them, always at the edge, always still, always facing the road, always gone by the time the bus arrived. Never getting on, never acknowledged by any of the other children, never arriving from anywhere I could track. The last morning I saw it, something was different. The child was standing in the usual spot, but it had turned, not toward the road, toward my car. It was standing at the edge of the gravel facing my windshield, and even at that distance, even in the early morning gray, I could see that the face was wrong. Not wrong like an injury or a deformity. Wrong like a drawing of a face. Like someone had placed the features in approximately the right positions, but hadn't understood the proportions. The eyes too far apart. The mouth too wide. The whole arrangement of it too flat, as if the face were pressed against glass from the other side. I did not get out of the car. I locked the doors, which I had never done before at a school bus stop in 11 years of sitting in that lot. The bus came. 7 children got on. The thing at the edge of the gravel stayed where it was and kept its face pointed at my windshield until the bus pulled away and I drove back up the road without looking in the mirror. It has not been back since. It has been 4 weeks. I find myself hoping the gap just means the pattern has changed and not that it found what it was waiting for. That it was standing at that stop every morning, patiently, the way something stands when it is waiting for a particular child to appear. And that it is now somewhere else, at some other stop, on some other road, standing at the edge of the gravel in the early morning gray, its wrong face turned toward the road, waiting. Not everything at the edge of a crowd is waiting for the bus. My father was one of the most organized men I have ever known. I say this not with sentiment, but with conviction. He was a man of his word. 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 He was a but as a plain fact that is directly relevant to what I found. He kept his tools on labeled pegboard. He kept his financial records in color-coded binders going back to 1987. He kept a logbook in the glove compartment of his truck with the date and mileage of every oil change, every tire rotation, every repair, with the name of whoever did the work and what it cost. He was a machinist for 31 years, and he thought in tolerances. He believed that disorder was a form of disrespect for your own time, and he applied that belief to every surface in his life. His basement workshop was organized well enough that you could have performed surgery in it. He also hunted. Deer, mostly, and some turkey in the spring. He had been hunting the ridges behind his property since he was 12 years old, and he was 67 when he died, which means he had 55 years of accumulated knowledge about those hills that died with him, which is its own kind of loss. But the relevant thing is how he handled his venison, because it was the same as everything else. Every piece of meat that went into his chest freezer was wrapped in the white butcher paper, sealed with tape, and labeled in permanent marker with the contents, the date, and the location where the animal was taken. Not just the year, the date. Not just deer. The stand number from his hand-drawn map of his property that hung in the workshop. He had 15 years of freezer records. When I cleaned out the house after the funeral, I could trace his harvests back to 2008 by reading the packages. He died in October. A stroke, fast, no warning. I drove up from Charleston, handled the arrangements, and spent the following 2 weeks going through the house. His organization made it easier in some ways. The financial records were current and clearly marked, the important documents were in one place, and the utilities were simple to transfer. I was grateful for it. It felt like one last gift from him, the knowledge that even in dying he had made things manageable for whoever came behind. I got to the chest freezer in the 3rd week. It was in the basement, beside the workshop, and it was nearly full. He'd had a good fall. I found 3 packages of venison from that October, taken just weeks before he died. The rest of the freezer was a record of the previous 2 seasons. Everything properly labeled, everything orderly. I started at one end and worked toward the other, pulling each package, reading the label, deciding what to keep and what to donate to the church food pantry, which is what he would have wanted. I found the unlabeled packages near the back of the freezer, under 2 layers of properly labeled venison, and there were 11 of them. Each one wrapped in the same white butcher paper, sealed with the same tape. But no label, no contents, no date, no stand number. Just the white paper and the tape. 11 packages in a chest freezer that had not contained a single unlabeled package in at least 15 years of recorded history. I told myself he'd run out of markers. I told myself he'd been in a hurry, or tired, or had planned to label them later. I held the explanations up against what I knew about the man, and they didn't fit. But I held them anyway, because the alternative required me to ask a question I wasn't ready to ask. I set the unlabeled packages to one side and finished going through the rest of the freezer. Everything else was labeled. Everything else was correct. Only these 11. I left them in the freezer. I locked the house and drove back to Charleston and told myself I would deal with them on my next visit. The next visit was 3 weeks later. I went down to the basement and opened the freezer and found the unlabeled packages exactly where I'd left them. And then I stood there for a long time because I had finally asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. When were they put there? His last labeled package was dated October 3rd. He died on October 19th. 16 days. In that 16 days, between the labeled packages and his death, he had put 11 unlabeled packages in his own freezer. A man who had labeled every package for 15 years had in the last 2 weeks of his life created 11 packages he couldn't bring himself to label. Not forgot. Couldn't. I knew him. He didn't forget to do things. I picked one up. I held it. The contents were firm and shaped in a way that was consistent with meat, with something solid wrapped in paper and frozen. I set it back down. I picked up another one and held it and put it back. I stood at the open freezer for a long time. I am a grown man. I have dressed deer since I was a teenager. I know what every part of an animal looks and feels like through a layer of butcher paper, and I know how it settles in your hands when you pick it up. These packages did not feel like any part of a deer that I could name. I put them all in a garbage bag. I did not open any of them. I tied the bag shut and put it in the back of my truck and drove it to the county transfer station and dropped it in the dumpster and drove home. I did not look inside the bag. I decided not to look inside the bag, and I stand by that decision, and I am not going to second guess it now. But I have thought every day since about what my father knew in those last 16 days that he couldn't put a label on. What he found, or what found him, in the hills he had hunted for 55 years. What he brought home from those ridges in October and chose to keep but could not name. And I think about the fact that he kept them. He didn't get rid of them. He put them in the freezer in the back under everything else, the way you put something away that you haven't decided what to do with yet. The way you keep something you're not ready to look at. The way a man who labeled everything for 15 years keeps the 11 things he went to his grave without explaining. I think about what he was doing out on that ridge in October. And I think about the fact that he kept going back 11 times in 16 days. Whatever it was, it didn't scare him off. He went back for it again and again, and every time he came home with something he put in the freezer in the dark and covered with other things and never wrote a word about. My father, who wrote down the mileage every time he changed his oil. My father, who believed disorder was disrespect. 11 packages in the back of the freezer with nothing on them but tape. Whatever he found in those hills, he wanted to keep it close. And he wanted to keep it cold. A man who labeled everything for 15 years left 11 packages blank. That is not forgetfulness. That is a decision. I have been driving Route 9 between Oceana and Pineville for going on 14 years. When I drive it 5 nights a week coming home from the second shift at the lamp assembly plant in Mullins. That is roughly 45 miles of 2-lane state highway in the dark. And I have driven it in every kind of weather this part of the state can produce. Black ice, dense fog, blinding snow, the kind of rain that comes off the ridges and turns the road into a river for 20 minutes and then quits. I know every curve, every pothole, every wide spot where the deer come out of the tree line in October. I know the houses with the porch lights that are always on and the houses with the porch lights that are always off. I know the exact place where the cell signal dies as you drop into the valley near Baileysville and the exact place it comes back. I am a calm driver and I have never had an accident in 14 years on that road. I say all of this so you understand that what I saw was not the product of tired eyes and an unfamiliar road. I know that road the way I know my own face, which is why I know that what I saw did not belong on it. The first time was a February night about 4 years ago. It was cold, low teens, no snow on the ground, but the shoulders were hard with frost. I was maybe 8 miles past Baileysville, coming around a long left-hand curve that opens up into a short, straight stretch before the road bends again. My headlights swept the straight stretch and I saw her. A woman standing on the right shoulder about 100 yards ahead. White dress, what I would later call a nightgown, standing facing the road. And I slowed down out of pure reflex. A person on the shoulder of a rural highway at 11 at night in February is an emergency in waiting. And as I got closer, I registered several things almost simultaneously. She was not wearing a coat. She was not wearing shoes. She was standing in what I now saw was a thin layer of ice on the shoulder. And she was not moving. Not walking, not flagging, not reacting to my headlights at all. Just standing. I pulled onto the shoulder about 30 feet ahead of her and got out. The cold hit me hard through my jacket. The kind of cold that gets into your joints in the first 30 seconds. I called out to her, and she did not respond. I walked back toward her. She was a white woman, maybe 60, maybe 70, thin, her gray hair loose around her face. The nightgown was thin cotton, the kind you sleep in. Her feet were bare and dark. I could see the discoloration from where I was, the bluish black of skin that has been in severe cold for a serious amount of time. She was looking at the tree line on the other side of the road. Not at me, not at my truck, at the tree line. I spoke to her again. I said, "Ma'am, can you hear me?" I said, "Are you hurt?" Nothing. She was breathing. I could see that. But her eyes were open and fixed, and there was something about the quality of her stillness that was different from a person in shock. A person in shock has a fragility to their stillness. They look breakable. She did not look breakable. She looked like she had been standing there for a long time and intended to keep standing there, and the cold was not going to change that. I did not have signal. And I got back in my truck and drove 7 miles to the gas station at the junction and called the sheriff's department and drove back. She was gone. The deputy who came out walked the shoulder with me. No footprints in the frost leading away. No blood, no fabric, nothing shed or dropped. Just the cold and the dark and the 2 impressions in the rime ice where her bare feet had been. Pressed in deep, the kind of depth that comes from standing very still for a very long time. The deputy took my statement without much expression. He asked me to describe her again. I described her. He wrote it down. Then he said, very carefully, that my description matched 3 previous reports from that same stretch of Route 9 in the previous 2 winters. Same location, within 100 yards of the same spot. Same woman, same nightgown, same bare feet, same fixed gaze at the tree line. All in February. All between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. All gone by the time anyone came back with help. And then he said the thing I have been carrying since. He said the oldest report they had on file for that location was from February of 1974. The caller, a truck driver, had described the same woman in the same white nightgown standing on the same shoulder. That report was 50 years old. She had not aged in 50 years of February sightings on that road. I drove Route 9 differently after that, eyes forward, hands on the wheel, speed steady, not faster. Faster would mean I was afraid, but deliberate, attentive in a new way. In the years since, I have seen her 3 more times. Always February, always the same stretch, always the same stance, facing the road until I slowed, and then, as the last 2 times, turning to face the tree line before I got close enough to stop. As if she had learned to turn away before the witness arrived. The last time I saw her was this February. What was different was what she was doing with her hands. I almost didn't catch it because I was keeping my eyes on the road like I had trained myself to do. But I caught it in the periphery, and I looked before I could stop myself. Her arms were raised. Not raised like someone signaling for help. Raised in front of her, elbows bent, palms facing the tree line across the road. Like she was holding something back, like she was standing between the road and the trees with her hands out, bracing. Like whatever she had been placed there to hold, or warned to hold, or compelled to hold at the edge of that strip of blacktop for 50 years. Whatever is in those trees that she has been facing every February for longer than I have been alive, had gotten close enough this year that she had to use her hands. I don't slow down anymore. I don't call the sheriff. I drive that stretch of Route 9 at a steady 45 miles an hour. And I watch the center line, And I do not look at the right shoulder, and I do not look at the tree line. And I tell myself, it is just a road. It is just a road. It is just a road I have driven for 14 years and will drive for 14 more. The woman in the nightgown is not my concern. The thing in the trees that she is holding back is not my concern. But some nights when I come around that long left-hand curve and my headlights sweep the straight stretch ahead, I find myself pressing on the gas just a little, just enough. And I keep my eyes on the yellow line until the curve comes back and that stretch of shoulder is behind me. And I breathe out in a way I pretend not to notice. And I keep driving home. 50 years of February sightings. She has not aged. Whatever she is holding back, neither has it. I need you to know that I have spent 22 years doing environmental assessment work in West Virginia, which means I have walked into more abandoned industrial sites than most people will see in a lifetime. I have walked through closed chemical plants with their tanks still full of things that had no safe place to go. I have documented coal processing facilities where the equipment was still running on automated systems years after the last human employee left. And I have been in collapsed underground structures and flooded pump houses and structures so compromised by decades of acid mine drainage that the steel had thinned to the translucency of foil. I do not spook. I carry a dosimeter and a 4-gas monitor, and I take my readings, and I note what I find, and I go home. That is the job, and I am good at it, and nothing about 22 years of it has changed the way I sleep. What happened at the Aldridge logging camp changed the way I sleep. I want to be precise about that. Not a story I tell at parties. A change in how I sleep, permanent, ongoing, and directly caused by what I found, and more specifically, by what I eventually understood about what I found. That understanding is the part I can't put down. At the Aldridge camp was a commercial logging operation that ran from roughly 1938 to 1961 in a hollow in Nicholas County. At its peak, it employed about 40 men, had a bunkhouse that slept 32, a cookhouse, the equipment shed, a small office building, and a separate structure that the old surveys labeled simply as the foreman's quarters. The operation closed when the accessible timber was exhausted and the economics stopped working. The company that owned it went bankrupt in 1963. The land changed hands 4 times in the following decades, and by the time my firm was contracted to do a baseline environmental assessment for a potential conservation purchase, it had been sitting in a family trust for 18 years with nobody visiting. My colleague, Renata, and I drove up on a Monday morning in June. The access road had been a logging track in 1961 and was now barely a path, overgrown to one lane of navigable ruts that our truck could manage if we moved slowly. The hollow was beautiful in that particular way that reclaimed industrial land sometimes is. The forest had come back thick and varied. The creek was running clear. The wildlife was abundant and unbothered. We flushed 3 deer in the first mile. The sky above the hollow was the specific deep blue of a West Virginia summer morning, and there was no sound except the creek and the birds and the engine. Renata said it felt like the land had exhaled, and I understood what she meant. Whatever the camp had been, the land had moved past it. The structures were what we expected. The bunkhouse was the largest building, a long, low rectangle of board and batten construction, and the roof partially collapsed at one end, the rest still holding. The cookhouse adjacent to it had fared worse. The floor rotted through in several places, the cast iron range still squatting in the kitchen end, unmoved and unmovable. The equipment shed was open on one side where the wall had come down, but the bones of it were solid. We documented everything methodically, photographed, took soil samples near the equipment areas, checked the creek for legacy contamination. Standard work. We spent 2 full days doing it properly. The foreman's quarters was a smaller, separate structure about 50 yards from the bunkhouse, at the head of the hollow near the base of the ridge. It was in better shape than the other buildings, smaller, better built, the kind of structure that someone had put real care into. The roof was intact. The porch was intact. The door was closed, not locked. Closed. Which was itself slightly unusual since every other door in the camp had been standing open or gone entirely for 60 years. I opened it on our second afternoon and went in. The interior was one room. A wood stove, a table, a chair, a shelf, a single cot against the far wall, and on the cot, a blanket, folded, placed at the foot of the cot in a neat rectangle, the way you fold a blanket when you're making a bed or when you're leaving a place in order. A wool blanket, gray, with thin red stripes, the kind of camp supply blanket that was common in that era. It was dusty but not rotted, not chewed by animals, not mildewed or damp. Just there, folded, placed, as if whoever had put it there would be back for it. I noted it in my report as a surviving artifact. I photographed it, or I moved on. Renata and I finished the assessment, compiled our notes, drove out that evening. I wrote the report over the following week and submitted it, and considered the job closed. The Conservation Trust purchased the land that fall and contracted us for a follow-up visit to mark the boundaries for their management plan. Renata had another job that week, and I went alone in late October. Different season, same hollow. The forest had turned, the light was different. The creek was higher from the fall rains. I walked the boundaries and placed my markers, and in the late afternoon, I found myself back at the foreman's quarters because I had a remaining survey point near it that I needed to confirm. I went in. I do not know why I went in. The survey point was outside. There was no professional reason to enter the building. But I opened the door and I went in and I looked at the cot and the blanket was not folded anymore. It was spread, laid flat across the cot the way you lay a blanket when you are sleeping under it. The corners hanging down, the surface smoothed out but pressed in the center where a body had lain. Not dramatically, not violently. Just the ordinary settled impression of a person who had slept there and gotten up and left the blanket behind. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I told myself it was an animal. A deer can push through a door that isn't latched and lie down in a building, and I have seen stranger things. I told myself the blanket had simply shifted over the months between visits, settled by gravity and the movement of air through the building. And I held those explanations in my mind, and they did not fit, and I knew they did not fit, but I held them anyway. What I could not explain away was the floor. In the dust on the floor between the cot and the wood stove, there were boot prints, not animal tracks. Boot prints, a man's work boot, heavy tread, size 10 or 11. Coming in from the door, moving to the wood stove, moving back to the cot, moving back to the door, a circuit. The circuit of a man who has come in from outside and checked the stove for heat and gone to his bed, and in the morning gotten up and left. The prints were not old. They were not ancient compacted dust impressions. They were clear, sharp-edged prints in the layer of fresh dust that had settled since my June visit. Someone had been in this building between June and October, sleeping in the foreman's cot, going through the routine of the place as if the place were still running, as if 1961 had not happened. As if whatever shift this man was working was still ongoing, 60 years after the last log came down out of this hollow, 60 years after the last paycheck, 60 years after the company went bankrupt and the road grew over and the forest came back and swallowed the whole operation into itself like it was never there. I went back to my truck and I sat with the doors locked until the last light went out of the hollow. I drove out in the dark on the overgrown track, and I have not been back. My report noted the blanket as disturbed, possibly by wildlife. It did not include the boot prints. I am not able to explain why I left them out, except that including them would have required me to explain them. And I had no explanation that did not require me to say something I am not prepared to put in a professional document. Something is still reporting for work at the Aldridge camp. Something is still sleeping in the foreman's quarters and rising in the morning and going through the motions of a job that ended before I was born. Clocking in every day for 60 years in an empty camp at the head of a hollow that the forest is slowly taking back. I think about what kind of thing does that. What kind of thing is so bound to its routine, so fixed in its purpose, that it keeps showing up to work long after the work is gone, long after everyone else has left, and long after there is no one left to log and no one left to pay, and nothing left in the hollow but the creek and the birds and the bones of the buildings and the folded blanket on the cot, waiting for the next shift to start. The camp closed in 1961. Something still clocks in. Some routines outlast the people who made them,